If you were 3,596 kilometers from the nearest person, circling around the moon in the complete emptiness of space, what kind of thoughts would be running through your mind? Fear? Maybe loneliness? In 1971, for 3 whole days, this was Alfred Warden's reality. As a command module pilot of Apollo 15, he orbited around the moon while his crewmates explored its surface, setting a record for what would come to be known as the most physically isolated human in history, with nothing but the soft hum of machinery and the vast vacuum of space to keep his mind busy. And yet, as terrifying as this sounds, when he returned to Earth and was asked about his experience, Alfred didn't speak of fear. He spoke of euphoria, as if in the cold, dark silence of space, the isolation that shatters so many people had the opposite effect on him. In complete isolation, something else usually happens. Sailors adrift for weeks begin to forget who they are. Volunteers in sealed rooms start hearing voices that aren't there. It's as if the lack of comfort and sources of distraction force the mind to turn inward. And for many, that's where things begin to fall apart, because the deeper you go, the more fragile the psyche feels, and the farther it's pushed, the more unsettling it becomes to confront. But in some cases, and this is very rare, the deeper one goes into their own mind, the stranger and more unexpected the journey becomes. So what is the deepest anyone has ever gone into their mind? And more importantly, what is it that they found in there waiting for them? Of all the ways one could descend into the depths of their mind, few were as haunting as drifting alone through a vast, indifferent sea. This is the path Donald Crowhurst chose, or perhaps, more accurately, the path he couldn't escape. As an inventor and businessman, his ventures were falling apart, and his debt was mounting. So when the Sunday Times announced the first ever non-stop solo round-the-world race, he saw an opportunity. But to enter, he needed a boat, and to build it, he needed cash. So he struck a deal with a sponsor, using his family home as collateral, a desperate bid to fund the voyage. But from the beginning, his gamble was never about the glory. For him, it was a chance to prove the value of his invention. So even though the boat wasn't ready, and his skills weren't enough, he set sail, and almost immediately ran into trouble. Mechanical failures, leaks, and a boat that just wasn't ready for the open ocean. In this race that he had to win, that he'd staked his life on, he was already behind. But turning back meant losing everything. So he made a decision, one that would sever him not just from land, but from reality itself. He started faking his coordinates, reporting false positions, and creating the illusion of progress, all while drifting aimlessly through the Atlantic. But while the lies began as a practical way to buy time, they quickly turned into something more consuming. Once committed, he couldn't just fake his position once, he had to fabricate an entire voyage. The distances traveled, the fake storms he confronted, and the speed of a journey that wasn't happening. At some point, it isn't lying anymore. It's creating an alternate reality and living inside of it, which for 240 days is what he did, completely alone in an endless ocean aboard a crumbling boat. With nobody to talk to and no feedback loops to anchor to, the only companion he could count on was guilt. And at some point, the burden of the lie outgrew the man who told it. To survive psychologically, he had to become 2 people at once, and kept 2 logbooks. One, the official record, clean and composed, charting his triumphant voyage, and the other, hidden and raw, documenting what was really going on in his mind. It is within the pages of this second book that he left behind a map, perhaps the furthest inward anyone has ever gone. And unfortunately, he didn't find some enlightened self. All that can be deciphered is a mind in freefall, desperate to hold itself together. Piece by piece, he built an entire belief system, a personal mythology born from guilt and from isolation. Eventually, his logbooks would be found, and together they reveal something haunting. Even if built on lies, the psyche prefers a complete story over an incoherent one. And when truly alone, without other people to keep you grounded, the mind will invent a new reality, not to deceive itself, but simply to survive. Under this level of pressure, such an outcome is virtually guaranteed, but the threshold may be far lower than we realize. In the Gensfield Experiment, researchers created a simple setup. A person sits in a chair with their eyes covered, bathed in a soft red light, while white noise plays through their headphones. Within minutes, something very strange begins to happen. The brain, starved of input, begins to fill in the silence. Some report flashes of light, while others hear voices. This is without weeks of solitude and without isolation. And yet, the effect is eerily consistent. When cut off from stimulation, the mind hallucinates, not as a glitch, but as an act of creation. Taken one step further, the float tank amplifies this phenomenon. Instead of just limiting sight and sound, it removes everything: touch, gravity, even the sense of time, all by submerging the individual in a salt water warm to match the body's temperature. It's basically the closest replication we have of complete nothingness. And again, almost immediately, the heightened inward focus triggers hallucinations, with some people even reporting ego death. Put simply, we don't need months of solitude or trauma or even psychedelics to reach the edge of the mind. All it takes is a dimming of the senses, and sometimes people choose to do that, to go there deliberately. The field of analytical psychology popularized the idea that a person's interior life requires just as much exploration as the one they inhabit externally, with people like Freud viewing the unconscious as a chamber of forbidden desires. But to Jung, it was something even stranger, a vast landscape with dangerous waves that had to be tamed. And in the Red Book, he set out to map it. This book has been described as a creative illness, a descent into the underworld, a bout of narcissism and laced with psychosis. But however you choose to interpret it, there's no doubt that Jung, who was 38 when he started writing it, got lost in the soup of his mind. At the time, he was haunted by troubling visions and an inner voice, which, in his own words, he described as doing a schizophrenia. But instead of resisting, he let it consume him, and the result was 6 years of struggle, all to prevent his mind from filtering out what his unconscious wanted to show him. This led him to the borderlands of his mind, a place filled with both creative abundance and the potential for ruin. The very same threshold those who've gone mad and great artists of the past have attempted to cross. And he recorded it all, every single step of his descent. What he found there was unlike anything the field of psychology had ever seen before. He met a wise old man with wings, a red-haired god of the children, and a moment where he was forced to watch the slaying of himself continuously. All of which he interpreted not as symbols of a dream, but autonomous beings formed out of the fragments of his psyche. But here's the thing, while up until this point, those I've mentioned who embarked on this descent went mad, maybe some will disagree, but Jung didn't, almost as if he found a way of giving form to the formlessness. And that's because the Red Book is a conversation, a way of integrating the parts of himself he'd long disowned and buried. It was at the bottom of this so-called dialogue that he would create perhaps his greatest theory, the concept of the self, which in his vision is everything that you are and everything that you could become, including things like the ego but also the shadow, your wounds but also the anima. And somehow, it is precisely by confronting all these fragmented elements that he not only survived the descent, but emerged as a changed man. No one before, and arguably no one since, has walked so far into the wilderness of their own mind, remained lucid, and come back with a map. Most people either fear the descent or are devoured by it. Jung, on the other hand, transcribed it. And although he never fully completed the Red Book, its core insight is unmistakable. What might appear as madness from the outside can, under the right conditions, be a path to wholeness. Similarly, no exploration of the mind would be complete without mentioning Buddhism, a tradition that, unlike others who look towards the heavens, turns its gaze entirely inward. It's been described as a centuries-old technology for going deeper into the mind than any modern psychological system, not necessarily for the purposes of reflection, but for the purpose of transformation. And contrary to what most may believe, it isn't always peaceful. The early stages are marred by intense psychological material, grief, rage, fear, and trauma, things the mind normally tries to avoid. But here's the thing, when isolated individuals start the descent into their mind, it can seem like an anomaly. But when entire cultures build ritual structures and teachings around it, the implication is there's something in the depths worth finding, and more than that, repeatable, since, as a tradition, it may be the only culture devoted at scale to exploring the mind, with systems and practices like meditation designed to take people into those depths reliably. A necessary safeguard, as beyond the emotional turmoil of the first stage lies the annihilation of the self, a terrifying experience that in some can even cause psychosis. But it's also the edge the practice was designed to cross, because if you keep going, you'll reach the bottom, emptiness. And it is here, in the complete, silent emptiness, that you'll find nirvana, which I suspect is the exact same state Alfred Warden stumbled into. Alfred Warden didn't meditate in a cave or study ancient texts. He wasn't a monk and didn't seek nirvana. Yet by sheer circumstance, in the vacuum of space, thousands of miles from any other humans, he experienced the same psychological crucible, which, in his own words, he described as being part of the universe. It is in this void, in the liminality of his position, between the earth and the cosmos, the self and the universe, that he found a deep sense of peace, with his isolation making this experience possible. In space, there is no sound, no weather, and no life. Nothing to distract you from the full weight of such an endless, unforgettable view. And with his previous training preparing him for this moment, it was as if he was able to bypass the painful stages the others had to endure. And that's because he did. In neuroscience literature, awe has been shown to affect the brain in the same way meditation does, by downregulating the default mode network and reducing the attachment to the self. But with a caveat, it's unique in the sense that it forces the mind to reconcile with something incomprehensible. So while something like meditation requires steps, awe quite literally works by shocking the mind out of its normal operating mode, due to an experience so big the brain can't categorize it. And yet, the experience of awe isn't just beautiful, it's revealing. Because what Alfred Warden stumbled into is what others have spent a lifetime chasing, the place beyond the self, peace. What the monks in Buddhism call nirvana, what the psychoanalyst Jung called individuation. The point is, different traditions and different people all arrived at the same conclusion, that the very bottom of the mind, where the ego dies and the self dissolves, is something worth pursuing, even if it isn't guaranteed. And years later, when Alfred Warden was asked about his experience, he described it as the single most impactful event in his life. Which makes me think, in the age of constant distraction, where loneliness is rising and silence is avoided, maybe that's what we're missing, the ability to go inward. Because at the end of the day, the further you move from the world, the closer you get to yourself.